Hello and good afternoon. I'm Nell Payne, chair of the NSCDA Planning Committee for the symposium and a former director of the Smithsonian's Office of Government Relations. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Leslie Greene Bowman. Since 2008, Leslie has served as president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which owns and operates the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Monticello. Prior to her time at Monticello, Leslie served as director of the Winterthur Museum for 9 years. She earned her Bachelor of Philosophy in American History and Art History at Miami University and her Master of Arts in Early American Culture as a Winterthur Fellow at the University of Delaware. Leslie has spearheaded efforts to bring history forward to national and global conversations, propelling restoration, dialogue, and programs that offer an honest, complicated, and inclusive view of our past as common ground for all Americans. Leslie, thank you so much for being with us today. We're very much looking forward to your presentation and to the audience questions, which will come afterward and be moderated by Catherine Newsom, curator of the museum at Dumbarton House, the NSCDA headquarters. Leslie?
Thank you, Nell. It's a delight to be here. I'm honored to be part of this amazing conference. I thank you, Nell. I thank the Smithsonian. I thank the National Society of the Colonial Dames for the opportunity to share our journey at Monticello towards a more honest and inclusive portrayal of our past. And that means starting with recognizing that the land where I am today and on which Monticello as a house and plantation exist is the homeland of the Monacan Indian nation, who have been its caretakers for centuries prior to settlement by Anglo-Virginians. It's also land where the Manahoac people lived when Anglo-Virginians first journeyed into these lands, or what are now also known as the Piedmont. But by the 18th century, these lands were taken over by white settlers. Monticello was created as a plantation, worked by humans in bondage. Our country now is grappling with systemic racism. That racism originates in slavery, and slavery is an original sin of our founding. Next. So that means Monticello is a place of reckoning today. It was a 5,000-acre slave plantation, but also the home of the man who had the courage to write a truth that was anything but self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unalienable for white men with property, yes. 2.5 centuries later, have we truly expanded those rights to all of those who were alienated at the beginning? Women, Blacks, Native Americans? Still, you can't deny that Thomas Jefferson gave this fledgling nation a mission statement that has defined our character. It is among the most quoted sentences in the English language. It has been a rallying cry for freedom fighters here and around the world. Half the nations on the planet, did you hear that? Half have founding documents that quote or reference Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence. You'll find a link in the chat box if you want to know more about the international impact of America's birth certificate. But that same man who wrote those world-changing words, that Enlightenment visionary of freedom and equality, owned 607 human beings over the course of his lifetime. Their voices, their struggles, their stories must be heard at Monticello. We are sharing them. They matter. We are in an international site of conscience. We're the only American slave plantation on UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites. We have an obligation to share all the stories we know and to learn more, not only of Jefferson and his legal family, but especially of the enslaved community that made his life's work possible. Next. Monticello is a place to reckon with the uncomfortable truths of our past, to come as close as you can to having a conversation with one of the smartest men of any generation, and to grapple with the really important question, what does this all mean? I think it means Monticello is an epicenter to reckon with the tensions between our beliefs and our actions, a place, as Lonnie Bunch phrased it on Monday, and I quote, to contextualize difficult moments, end of quote. I think it means we have work to do. Every one of us who cares about what it means to be American and what we want this nation to stand for. This is a museum's essential role, to bring history forward into national conversations and concerns. That's our challenge, and that's our opportunity. But how do we find the stories of the enslaved? How did we bring them forward into the public arena? So much of that answer is like the iceberg, below the surface and absent from public view. Next. If you want to tell the real story, the whole story, an honest story, then you have to spend the time and money and political capital to find it, to recover the evidence of those who have been erased, denied, and marginalized. And that has meant decades of research. At Monticello, it began in the 1950s with archaeological research. Little was left above ground, so we had to find the records of enslaved life under the earth. There's been exhaustive work and research over the last 60 years, but until recently, it remained largely in the academic and university sphere and not really known or recognized by the public. There's a link in the chat box if you want to know more about our archaeology. From the 1950s, when that research began, through the early 1990s, visitors to Monticello expected and toured a patriotic shrine to Thomas Jefferson, with little or no mention of slavery. Next. The archaeological discoveries were revelatory, and they instigated documentary and oral history research in the 1990s, focused entirely on understanding slavery. Thankfully, there was a visionary historian at Monticello in those years. She wrote this book. Lucia, known as Cinder Stanton, devoted her life to understanding the stories and contributions of the enslaved community, and she was joined by others. Because of archaeologists and historians, Monticello is one of the best preserved, best researched, and best documented of slave plantations in its period. Next. We have names, we have marriages, we have children, we have deaths recorded in Jefferson's farm book. Names. So much of the history of enslaved people, including their names and parentage, was ignored, never recorded or recovered. But at Monticello, we have firsthand knowledge of individuals and families to whom much is given, much is expected. Next. So in 1993, on the 250th anniversary of Jefferson's birth, Monticello launched a transformational oral history project, the brainchild of that same Cinder Stanton. Called Getting Word, its purpose was to locate and record the oral histories of the descendants of Monticello's enslaved families. This rich trove of memories from more than 100 interviews now spans 7 generations. It has expanded our understanding of life at Monticello, and maybe just as importantly, the trajectory of those families when they were freed from bondage. It has also reunited families who were divided after Jefferson's death. The Getting Word African American Oral History Project is now the largest oral history project on slavery outside of the WPA. Today, we are in touch with almost 800 descendants. There's a link in the chat box if you want to access some of their stories. And that same year, in 1993, Monticello launched its first guided tour about slavery. It was a free addition to the house tour. But they called it the Plantation Life Tour, euphemistically. But then in 1998, a DNA report linked Sally Hemmings' descendants to the male Jefferson line. Monticello commissioned a scholar's report to evaluate the evidence and agreed with its findings that Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemmings' children, and they added that fact into interpretation. By 2000, Monticello had researched stories of hard work, great skill, of cultural and spiritual lives that flourished, often independent of Jefferson. But the majority of that work is still in academic channels and not readily visible to our visiting public. I came to Monticello in 2008. The time had come. The staff was eager. Everyone wanted to bring these stories into the visitor experience. And fortunately for us, my friend Lonnie Bunch offered to help and agreed to partner on an exhibition. Next, with the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, we partnered to create a major exhibition that opened on the Mall in 2012, entitled Slavery at Monticello, Paradox of Liberty. The show was groundbreaking because it revealed human beings, not a system of bondage, people with names and families and children and trades. It has now gone on 2 national tours and been seen by more than 1.5 million people in 7 American cities and 1 million more online. That statue of Jefferson foregrounds a wall with the names of the 607 people he owned. And in front of him, ironically, is a desk on which he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Next. And interestingly enough, you just were hearing about the Jefferson Bible. Those 2 shows overlap. So the show on the Jefferson Bible opened a couple of months before this show, and they were side by side in the American History Museum. This is a joyful reunion of descendants of the enslaved community at the opening of that show. Next. But we had so much more work to do. We had to make these stories that we put in the exhibition visible at Monticello. We had to make it possible for visitors to see and experience the landscape of slavery. Seeing is believing, and all they saw in those days was an iconic house on a mountain, the house on the nickel. With a transformational gift from David Rubenstein, we reconstructed some of the slave dwellings and workshops. And we brought forward the story of the most well-known person enslaved at Monticello, Sally Hemmings. In the 12 by 14-foot windowless room where she once lived, we installed a multimedia exhibit on her life. And we used only her son's words in that exhibit from an account he gave to an Ohio newspaper in 1873. Next slide. Her story has been part of Monticello's fabric for more than 200 years, even though her identity and the facts of her life have long been obscured. We have nothing to show what she looked like. We have no words written by her. But she is one of untold thousands of enslaved Black women who had no sovereignty over their bodies or their children. But there's something else that distinguishes Sally Hemmings. We have only Madison's words to substitute for what his mother might have said about her life. And I quote, "We all became free agreeably to the treaty entered into by our parents before we were born. We all married and have raised families." The most remarkable thing about Sally Hemmings is that at the age of 16, while in Paris, where she could have remained free, she negotiated with one of the most powerful men in America to come back with him to Virginia if he agreed to free her children. An unenforceable agreement that Jefferson kept. So let me show you a 2-minute cut from our multimedia exhibit. is the final message on the wall of her room. She died in Charlottesville in 1835. The location of her grave is unknown. In 2017, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Annette Gordon-Reed observed, though enslaved, Sally Hemings helped shape her life and the lives of her children, who got an almost 50-year head start on emancipation, escaping the system that had engulfed their ancestors and millions of others. Whatever we may feel about it today, this was important to her. Next slide. We opened Sally Hemings' room on Juneteenth in 2018 as the capstone of the completion of a 5-year, $35 million restoration to reveal the landscape and stories of slavery at Monticello. You will find some materials in the chat box on our Life of Sally Hemings exhibit, on the Getting Word Oral History Project, as well as on the opening of this project in 2018. The media response was positive. Washington Post and New York Times both did front page stories. Next, at that opening on Juneteenth. Next. There we go. At that opening, we celebrated, revealed, and invited conversations with descendants, trustees, advisors, leaders, and our visiting public. Next. Hundreds of descendants joined historians and thought leaders for a public program on the West Lawn. David Rubenstein was with us, and in honor of Juneteenth, he lent us an original copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, signed by Abraham Lincoln. Joining him that day were Annette Gordon-Reed, Darren Walker, and John Meacham. And as I said, there's a link in the chat box to that compelling program. So step by step, we are striving to reveal the real Monticello and to share the stories of all who lived and labored here. And it has been a journey. With my time remaining, just let me take you a little bit lower into the water, into the iceberg, and show you how. Next slide, please. These are some of the friends and consultants who helped us through the restorations and planning for that high-profile moment in 2018. This is Joshua Dubois on the left and his wife and team from Values Partnerships. You see, it wasn't just about putting back structures and telling more stories. It was also about bringing history forward. We knew we needed to be more proactive, to actively engage in national dialogues relevant to the legacy of slavery, and not just wait for the media to contact us for a quote. And we knew we needed help to do that. Next slide. So we sought out assistance from Joshua and his Washington-based firm, Values Partnerships, to help us bring forward the stories of the hidden and the marginalized, to help us guard against and learn from our own blind spots and hidden biases, and to help us reach African-American audiences. Next. We also revived and energized our National Advisory Committee for African-American Affairs. I shudder to think how many times we asked them to read our text panels for the Sally Hemings exhibit. And in 2016, as we were adding history and context to national conversations, we were offered the chance to partner with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the University of Virginia to celebrate the 50th anniversary of NEH. So we raised our hand to anchor programming on race. And in the fall of 2016, we hosted a landmark public summit entitled Memory, Mourning, and Mobilization, Legacies of Slavery and Freedom in America. Next. 2,200 people registered to come to this event on our West Lawn. Thousands more watched online as historians, descendants, and cultural leaders engaged in an open dialogue about the history of slavery and how its legacies continue to shape modern day issues of race and equality. The chat box has the link to that amazing day. It was a landmark moment for us. We leaned into the conversation and our community responded in huge numbers. I later learned that informal community dialogue groups were established on that day and continued in living rooms across Charlottesville. It's really important to walk the talk in your own communities. And in less than a year, Charlottesville would experience a tragedy of global infamy, the Unite the Right white supremacist rally of 2017. Next. The tragic events that August prompted us to reflect on and recommit to Monticello's 21st century imperative, that we are an essential place to understand what it means to be American, to grapple with the enduring legacies of freedom and slavery that are still shaping our society today. Next. Those events in August rocked our community and our country. And in the aftermath in Charlottesville, we've been reactive, we've been proactive, we've been introspective, and we've been just plain active. When our community announced a trip to Ghana to understand the African story, 3 of us joined the trip. This is one of our guides, meeting a colleague of his at Elmina Castle. A few staff also joined the pilgrimage to Montgomery, Alabama, to take soil from a lynching site in our county to the Memorial for Peace and Justice. And we also committed ourselves to training and diversity. Next. Before we opened Sally Hemmings' room in 2018, we embarked on diversity training for everyone at Monticello, and the board volunteered to lead that initiative. This is Annette Gordon-Reed giving a training session with the board. We continue that training yearly, even though we did take a pause during the pandemic. More than ever before, though, I think Jefferson's little mountain has something to say to us about who we are as Americans. Jefferson's vision for this nation was underscored by a fundamental belief in progress. He was convinced that through science, reason, civic engagement, universal education, the American experiment, and indeed the world, could be set on a course of perpetual improvement. In a very micro way, we are committed to that same vision. We're committed to improving and expanding the stories we hold at Monticello, so as to offer context and common ground for all our visitors, for all Americans. Next. So before I close, I just want to offer you a preview of 2 important projects underway right now. They are projects that honor and amplify the voices and lives of those who have been silenced, voices and lives that have so much to say to us today. Here you see a rendering of the burial ground for enslaved people, as it will look when we complete renovations. The burial ground was long forgotten by the 1970s. The graves were unmarked and overgrown. It almost fell victim to the expansion of a parking lot. But one African-American workman on the job protested. He knew of this place, the memory of which had been lovingly preserved in his community. And because of his courage, the burial ground was saved from the pavement. But there was evidently no thought of moving the parking lot, so the asphalt just encircled it. It was saved, but not honored. In 2009, when the visitor center was built, much more was done to protect and landscape and separate the cemetery from visitor traffic. But still, it seemed marooned and marginalized. So we have been working most closely with the descendant community on a major renovation, removing some of the parking, adding more seating, gravitas, sanctity, and including a dedicated seating area for the descendants inside the fence, marked here, as you see, private. Jointly with that project next, and with the same architects, we're working on a site above on the mountain, not far from the house, and adjacent to reconstructed slave dwellings and workshops that you can actually see behind me. It's a contemplative site, a place to think about what Monticello means, to ponder the stories of freedom and slavery and our complicated past. Again, we work very closely with the descendants of the enslaved community, and we honored their desire that the names of their ancestors be featured. So here's a rendering of what it might look like when it's completed. Next, a contemplative site is something important for us to think about what Monticello means, to ponder the stories of Jefferson, of the enslaved, of freedom and inequality in our complicated past. We are all in this field of preservation, because the past has something to say to us about our present and future challenges. Monticello is an essential place to understand what it means to be an American. It can be a place to have difficult conversations, to uncover and share stories of individuals rendered invisible by the dominant narrative, and to grapple with the very real connections between our history and present day realities. To quote again that Pulitzer Prize winning historian, Annette Gordon Reed, she offered this thought about Jefferson's relevance. Perhaps coming fully to grips with the paradoxes that Jefferson's life presents is what being an American is all about. He remains one of the best ways we have of exploring and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the American experiment. End of quote. As we are emerging and postulating on how to adapt to this changed world, we are laser focused on two priorities: positioning Monticello as a touchstone site for the nation's 250th birthday in 2026, and putting more effort and funding into ensuring the inclusion of multiple perspectives in our programming and for our audiences. And if you think about it, those two priorities are inseparable for us and for the nation. We fail if we celebrate the 250th as America did for the bicentennial. We fail if this is not the moment for an honest reckoning, a report card of our progress on the arc towards justice, a commemoration for all whose labors rewarded a young, fragile nation with power and influence, and a time to chart a course to realize the words of the Declaration. There are many more ways to engage with Monticello and many more stories to be shared than ever before. I hope you'll come and experience the power of place and ideas firsthand. And if you can't make it to the mountaintop, we have a robust collection of videos, live streams, blogs, podcasts, and more on our website and social media channels. Thank you.
Leslie, thank you very much for that powerful and engrossing presentation. It's wonderful to see how Monticello is dealing with these challenges and making opportunities of them. It's really beautiful. Now we'll turn it over to Catherine Newsom and questions from the audience. Catherine?
Great, thank you so much, Nell, and thank you, Leslie, for that wonderful presentation. We've got a whole lot of questions to touch on, maybe. About 15 minutes left in our symposium, so we'll jump back right in and see how far we can go. So quickly, just want to look back and think about your presentation for just a moment. You showed a number of slides associated with Sally Hemmings, and we had a question from the audience about the textile in the image that was used to represent Sally Hemmings. And is that a textile that's actually connected to her? Do you have tangible objects that are related to Sally Hemmings and her time at Monticello?
That is a great question, Catherine, and it reveals the dilemma of telling the stories of a woman from whom we have no artifacts, no words, no image. But what we used for that textile was the very common dress for enslaved people of that period, enslaved women. So we consulted various experts. We had it woven. I think actually Colonial Williamsburg helped us with that. And you also perhaps can therefore divine why we decided that a multimedia exhibit was preferable to a period room. We know that Sally Hemmings was living in that quarter, and we already had another room next to hers that was restored as a period space for an enslaved cook. And if you think about it, if you don't have any artifacts that are known to have been hers, her room wouldn't have looked any different had we done that than the cook's room next door, right? So it was a challenge. It was a bit of a break for a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You know, I came from Winterthur. It's all period rooms, right? But we felt that we had to tell her stories in ways that would be stronger and more emotional and more powerful than artifacts that had no connection to her.
That's great. And a great segue into our next question, which is, do you have any advice for other institutions and historic places, historic houses, to share their full history instead of simply brushing over the hard parts?
I think you stand on your truth. I think it's really important to stand and own your truth. And we actually have Jefferson to follow on that one, because his words associated with founding of the University of Virginia were follow the truth wherever it may lead. I think one thing we've discovered is go out front with your truth. Don't wait for others to find it and hold it up to you and wonder why you didn't talk about it, right? There's going to be criticism on all sides of the spectrum, but at least if you're showing up and doing your best to put it out there, you'll learn from mistakes. We've learned from our mistakes. We've stubbed our toe, but we just keep going. These stories are important. And if you have them at your sites, and if they haven't been told, it's an amazing opportunity.
Absolutely. So kind of continuing this same thread then, how does Monticello plan to continue your good example of advocacy and transparent interpretation of Jefferson's complicated legacy?
Well, we're working, as I said, on our plans for the 250th. And one of the things we want to do is expand our Getting Word oral history program, conduct more interviews. We want to begin a call for artifacts and memorabilia from that community, as they've shared with us their trajectory out of bondage into freedom. One of the great realizations of the Getting Word project, which was originally established to find out more about slavery at Monticello, is it actually told us much more about how individuals in bondage at Monticello carried the dream of freedom with them and were disproportionately part of the civil rights movement through these generations, right? So we want to begin showcasing and learning more about those chapters after Monticello. And we want to continue to, we're hoping to finish our archaeological survey of all 2,600 acres. We hope to find more burial grounds. We hope to find more evidence. We hope to find more groupings of where slave dwellings were on our property, right?
That's great. We'll probably come back and carry this thread a little further, but I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about you, you personally as a museum professional, as a preservationist, as a woman in this space. And I have a question that was posed to Carol Cadu of Winter yesterday, and I'd like to put it to you as well. As a woman leader in the museum and preservation field today, are there any unique opportunities or challenges that you've faced as a woman in the field or that you've observed?
You know, I have never thought of myself as a woman in the field. I thought of myself as a person in the field and was honored when I began to be thought of as a leader in the field. But I also think that any leader in the field has multiple leaders you look up to, right? So I suppose the one way in which I might have been thinking, well, I am a woman in this field, is that most of the people I looked up to were also women. Anne Darnancourt, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, right? Mimi Gates at the Seattle Art Museum. There are, and then women like Eleanor Roosevelt, right? I mean, they don't all have to be in your field. I think the challenges have, you know, much as men gave women the vote, men have given women these positions in most part. I've almost always worked for boards that were dominated by men. And I am grateful to them for listening to me and hearing my voice and sometimes disagreeing and having the civic dialogue and engagement that is needed, right? I think the biggest challenge for, I think, most women of my age in this field has been balancing the family and the work. But I've been able to be very fortunate in having a really supportive family who understood those roles and are proud of it.
That's great. And you mentioned a couple of names in your answer, that a couple of names of people that you have looked up to. So if you could, it'd be wonderful if you could talk a bit about mentorship or guidance from others that has played a role in your career trajectory, and how also you lend your voice and experiences to empower the next generation of professionals in this space.
Well, I think in my presentation, there was a moment when I said it's so important to walk the talk in your own community. you also need to do it with your staff and look at the walk and talk of those you look up to, right? I think David Rubenstein famously has said more than once that it's his failures that defined him. And, I think that's such an important thing to forgive yourself when you do stumble. Go for, I think very not long into my tenure here at Monticello, something backfired, was in the press. It was local. It wasn't anything national, but it was a little bit unpleasant. And you just dust yourself off and you own it. And you say to your board, didn't get that one right. We'll do better next time. We are all human. We all make mistakes and we learn from them. And I hope that the leadership that I've modeled myself after is, follow that truth. Be honest with who you are. Apologize when you need to apologize. Thank those around you who make you look good every single day, because none of us are leading or doing this by ourselves. It takes a village of supportive, wonderful, kind, hardworking human beings to make Monticello work, to make all of your organizations work, to make a difference in this field.
That's great. We'll stick with you for just another moment. You, in your career, you transitioned from a historian and a curator to a museum director. And what changed in your work through that transition, and what stayed the same?
Well, you always love the same things, right? I was in the art museum world for a long time before I segued over. I still think Monticello is an art museum too, so I don't think I've really left the art museum field. I think the way I like to think about it is I went from curating material culture to curating an institution. And even as a curator, I'm sure many on the phone will nod with this. I'm sorry, on the screen. You're fundraising as a curator, right? You're fundraising and fundraising. So it really was kind of a delightful transition to go from empowering your own project to making many people's projects empowered.
That's great. So we'll look at Monticello again a bit, and you as well. How have the histories of the women at Monticello, Sally Hemmings and others, influenced your practice today?
Well, I think there's a woman I want to talk about and respond to this question in a second, but these are heroic women. These stories are important. The influence on me is that it's our job and our role and our responsibility to bring them forward, to balance history, right? Her story, not just his. One of the interesting moments I had to do a little research, which I don't do very often anymore, was to compare, it was a presentation UVA asked me to do on Sally Hemmings and Jefferson's daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph. And they're born within 2 years of each other, maybe a year, I can't remember, but they actually grow up at Monticello. So Sally Hemmings comes to Monticello when she's probably 2 or 3 years old. They knew each other closely, right? And then remember, it's Jefferson's family back in Charlottesville, actually near Richmond at that point, who picked Sally Hemmings to go to Paris. He's already in Paris with his older daughter, Martha, the same young woman. And his younger daughter is in Richmond, near Richmond, at a plantation with family. And he gets news that his youngest baby daughter, 4-year-old Lucy, has died. And of course, he's lost his wife. He's a grieving widower. And in fact, that's why his friends in Congress got him to Paris, to distract him from his grief. So he writes and wants his last living child to join him in Paris. He wants to be together. It's the family that sends Sally Hemmings. Sally Hemmings is his wife's half sister. More on that in the chat box. But at that moment, now Sally is back with Martha, right? And Martha's in a private school in Paris, and Sally is not a slave in Paris. And we know from letters she was actually, clothes and gowns, and not gowns, but clothes and nice things were purchased for her to function as a servant, not a slave. So, think about those two women, and then how they grew up, and then who they married and what happened to them. And that's a whole nother lecture, but it's a fascinating moment of comparison between races and choices and women's choices, because Actually, Martha didn't have many more choices, but she did have control over her body and her children. She had no control over property. She probably didn't really choose who she married, right? So it's a real moment to look at the history of women and where we are now and where we've been.
Sure. Keeping this thread of talking about folks beyond Jefferson, the man himself, and the work that you all are doing with the descendant community and Sally Hemmings, et cetera. Did Monticello have to change? Did you all have to change your mission at all, or your interpretive scope, in order to tell these stories that go beyond Jefferson himself?
Well, that's a great question. Fortunately, I think our mission is pretty evergreen. It's education and preservation. So each board has determined what that might mean. And there's no question, though, that in the original name that was incorporated in 1923 in New York to buy Monticello from the Levy family. Monticello, by the way, was saved by the Jewish family, the Levies, because they were so grateful for religious freedom. They bought it in 1834 and had it for 90 years and operated it as a shrine to Thomas Jefferson. In 1923, when the foundation was formed, it was the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, right? So we've talked through this conference about reverence and history and worship of important places and important figures. Over the years, increasingly Monticello became more academic, and it began to reevaluate that name, and it changed in the 90s to just Thomas Jefferson Foundation. Of course, we honor Thomas Jefferson and his legacy, but we want all of the truth and not a pedestal on which to put a founder. And actually, Jefferson would be the first founder to say no statues, no pedestal. He didn't even want his birthday known. He wanted the birthday of the country known, but not his.
That's great. It looks like we've actually run out of time. We have a whole bunch of questions. Thank you, everybody, for submitting questions. And Leslie, thank you so much for your time. But I think we are out of time on the symposium. So
a great symposium. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Nell. You've all done a fantastic job.
Absolutely.
Leslie, this was a wonderful way to conclude the symposium. Thank you so much for participating.